At exactly 6:47 a.m. on a Monday morning, the peace of the cul-de-sac shattered with a roar loud enough to make birds scatter from the trees. A candy-apple red Lamborghini Aventador, exhaust screaming like a dragon with a megaphone, came to a full and dramatic stop, directly across my driveway gate. I blinked at the scene through my bedroom window, toothbrush hanging from my mouth, watching in disbelief as the driver, a platinum blonde woman in designer workout gear and a hot pink HOA windbreaker, stepped out, flicked her sunglasses down, and proceeded to set up a yoga mat on my side of the sidewalk. She didn't even glance at my gate. Instead, she pulled out her phone, positioned it at the perfect angle, and said, loud enough to pierce the glass, "Welcome back to Mindset with Karen. Today we're claiming space. Not just emotionally, physically. And yes, that includes parking wherever the hell we want." I choked on my toothpaste. My name's Darren. Quiet guy. Former military engineer. I live on the edge of a small suburban neighborhood, just beyond the official HOA boundary. At least, it used to be beyond it. I enjoy solitude, machines, and not being messed with, which made Karen's recent crusade to extend her personal brand of tyranny into my life all the more unbearable. That morning, though, was a new level. I had a job interview in exactly 1 hour and 30 minutes. I'd prepared for it for 3 weeks. It was at Atlas Defense Systems, a company that made tech for national security, the kind of place that valued structure, punctuality, and not being late because a self-declared neighborhood overlord had turned your exit into a runway. I threw on jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed my briefcase, and marched out the door. As soon as I hit the gravel path, Karen turned toward me with a smile so fake it should have come with a warning label. "Morning, Darren. Love the flannel. Country chic." I stopped short of the Lambo's mirror. "You're blocking my driveway. I have somewhere to be." She stretched her arms upward like she hadn't heard me, then casually said, "HOA guidelines clearly state that communal access lanes are not private property during community hours." I blinked. "Community hours? That's not a real thing." She shrugged. "It is now. Passed it last Thursday. We voted." "You and who, your cat?" She gasped like I'd insulted the crown. "That's rude. Mr. Whiskers is our treasurer." I could feel the vein in my forehead pulsing. I knew better than to escalate things. The problem with Karen wasn't that she didn't understand boundaries. It's that she understood them perfectly and then redrew them around herself like a queen mapping her kingdom. Last week she'd posted new signs at the community entrance labeling the street as Karen's cul-de-sac, HOA president forever. Some thought it was a joke. I knew better. And now, her car, a $300,000 rolling ego trip, was in my way on purpose. I gave her one last warning. "Karen, I'm telling you right now. You need to move the car or I will find another way out." She narrowed her eyes, sipping green juice through a stainless steel straw. "Is that a threat?" I smiled politely. "Not yet." Back inside, I called the local non-emergency line. The dispatcher told me that since the car was technically not abandoned, and since I lived on the edge of an HOA property zone, it could take hours to respond. The words hung in the air like a stale fog. Hours. That's when I felt it. That military itch. The one that shows up when logic fails and it's time to build a new kind of solution. I glanced across the yard toward my barn. It wasn't just any barn. It was where I kept my collection. Restored gear. Former projects. Historical machinery. Including a fully restored, street-legal, yes, I checked, M60 Patton armored tank. Decommissioned, retired, but mine. And perfectly capable of crossing uneven terrain. But I wasn't there yet. Not yet. By 9:15 a.m., I'd already missed the job interview. My call went straight to voicemail. I stood at the gate watching Karen and her crew pack up their yoga mats, still laughing, still acting like this was all some fun prank. One of them pointed at my house and whispered something behind her oversized sunglasses. Karen cackled, pulled out her phone again, and began filming another video. "Today we're talking about boundaries, and how some people need to learn to share the view." That was it. I turned and walked away before I did something regrettable. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the pressure of powerlessness. That feeling I thought I'd left behind in the battlefield. In the field, we had command, precision, action. Out here? Bureaucracy, falsified rules, and a Lambo with a personalized plate that read HOA Karen. Later that day, I found something else waiting on my fence post. A laminated letter taped inside a glittery pink envelope. The HOA hereby notifies resident Darren Miller of potential code violations concerning unauthorized gate barriers, visual obstructions, and lack of community compliance. The letter had been signed by Karen in purple gel pen, with a small heart next to her name. At the bottom, it read, "Consider this a friendly warning before formal action." Formal action? Against me? I didn't even sign the HOA charter. I checked the bylaws. Sure enough, they'd filed a recent amendment. The community zone had been re-evaluated, and a new map submitted to the county office. A red line now looped awkwardly around my property, like someone had spilled wine on a blueprint. Karen had extended her kingdom with a crayon and dared the world to stop her. I wasn't about to let that happen. I drove to the county building first thing the next morning. A young woman at the clerk's desk greeted me with a yawn and a too-large mug that said, "Keep calm and stamp forms." I explained the situation. She typed, blinked, frowned, then leaned in. "That map was submitted by one Karen Blakely? Says here it was attached to a temporary land annex request. Those usually take months to approve. This one was, so, fast-tracked. With handwritten note. I asked who approved it. She raised an eyebrow. Says, see attached, but there's no attachment. That's odd. Odd wasn't the half of it. Fraudulent filings. DIY legal lines. And now citations arriving in glittery envelope. Karen wasn't just an entitled neighbor, she was running a full-blown HOA dictatorship with no checks and balances. And unless someone pushed back hard, she was going to steamroll through anyone standing in her way. That night, I walked into the barn. The tank sat silent in the center, a relic of a different kind of war. But it didn't look old to me. It looked ready. And for the first time in weeks, so did I. Karen wanted a kingdom. She was about to learn that some castles come with catapult, and this one came with treads. The following morning, the cul-de-sac was unusually quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Karen's Lambo was gone, but in its place sat something worse, a brand-new wooden signpost at the edge of my property that hadn't been there yesterday. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and squinted at it. HOA Expansion Zone, Future Development Consideration Site. I nearly dropped the mug. Not only was Karen redrawing maps, but now she was planting physical markers to claim territory like she was playing real-life Monopoly. I yanked the sign out of the ground, roots and all, and tossed it to the curb. Before I even made it back to the porch, Karen appeared like she'd been summoned by the sound of defiance itself, hands on hips, flanked by two clipboard-wielding men in khakis and tucked-in polos. One of them wore a badge that read Community Officer Trenton. The other, a sour-faced man with a comb-over and oversized sunglasses, simply nodded like he was preparing to file a report on my breathing pattern. Karen didn't waste time. Hat's destruction of HOA property, Darren. Very bold for someone with 2 pending citations. I glanced at the clipboard guys, who looked like they were about to start measuring my lawn with rulers. I took a step closer, enough for Karen to flinch ever so slightly. This isn't HOA property. My deed predates your power trip. And until a court says otherwise, that sign is going in the trash. Trenton coughed politely, his confidence wobbling. We were told to verify easement boundaries. Nothing confrontational. Karen rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. Oh, stop being so spineless, Trent. He moved a half-step back. The other guy began taking photos of my gate like he was on a safari and had spotted an endangered species. Inside, I pulled up the county records again. The map she filed was still active. The bogus border wrapped around my house like a noose. But I wasn't just going to sit around and wait for bureaucracy to untangle it. I needed allies, or at least someone who understood what I was dealing with. That's when I remembered Mitch. Quiet guy. Lived 2 blocks over. He once told me Karen cited him for placing a garden gnome too close to the HOA visual perimeter. I found him trimming hedges in silence, his expression deadpan. The moment I mentioned the redrawn map, he snorted. She did it to the Jacksons too. Claimed their koi pond was a community hazard and filled it with cement. No one believed her until the HOA newsletter announced, new dog park coming soon. He shook his head. They moved 2 months later. I asked him if anyone had ever pushed back. He paused, thinking. Maybe 2 years ago, a guy named Phil threatened to sue her for defamation. He posted something online about her misusing HOA fund. The next day, his fence was declared culturally offensive, and she called animal control on his cat. I haven't seen him since. That's when it hit me. Karen didn't just enjoy control. She weaponized rules. Used citations like grenades and bylaws like barbed wire. She didn't just want peace in the neighborhood, she wanted submission. I returned home to find a new letter wedged into my mailbox. This one was printed on premium stock and smelled faintly of lavender. Notice of emergency inspection. HOA Community Preservation Team will enter property for fire safety assessment. Time of visit, 4 p.m. today. I stared at the clock. It was 3:52. They planned this. I bolted to the barn and opened both doors wide. The tank gleamed in the afternoon sun, as clean and polished as the day I'd finished restoring it. I had always kept it covered, but something inside me had shifted. I wasn't hiding anymore. Right on schedule, Karen arrived with her 2 goons, this time accompanied by a tall man in an official-looking vest labeled Fire Risk Evaluator. He wore sunglasses and carried a clipboard like it was an instrument of divine judgment. Karen smiled like she was hosting a reality show. Darren, we just need to make sure this lovely barn isn't a combustible threat to the community. The evaluator stepped inside, paused, and then stared at the tank like he'd stumbled upon a dragon sleeping in a garage. Is that real? I nodded. Restored M60. Street legal. Part of a historic preservation initiative. He blinked. That's extremely cool. Karen's face twitched. She jumped in. But it's not HOA approved. It's loud and obstructive and, Trenton, for some reason now behind her again, added, he didn't file for a parking variance for this vehicle. I handed the evaluator a folder. Inside were documents from the state's Historic Military Equipment Registry, the insurance, the legal clearance, and even a letter from a congressman I'd once invited for a photo op during Veterans Month. The evaluator flipped through the pages, expression unreadable. Karen hovered like a mosquito trying to suck authority from the air. Finally, the man spoke. Legally, he's not only permitted to house it, he's protected under Section 18B of the County Zoning Code. Karen looked like someone had unplugged her from the Matrix. What? You mean he can just have a tank? I crossed my arms. It's not just a tank, Karen. It's a historical exhibit. As the entourage shuffled away in awkward silence, Karen lingered behind. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She just stared at the tank, lips pursed, calculating. I knew that look. She wasn't backing down. She was reloading. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my yard. I noticed something I hadn't seen before, an HOA security camera mounted on a nearby tree, facing my barn. It hadn't been there last week. I grabbed a pair of binoculars and traced the wiring. Karen had installed it just outside my property line, pretending it was part of a local birdwatching project she'd announced 2 days ago. That's when it all clicked. She was building a file on me. A narrative. One she could pitch to local authorities or news if she wanted to label me unstable or dangerous. The tank was her next angle. She'd already lost the legality battle. Now she was going to try public opinion. Paint me as a menace. I couldn't afford that. So I changed strategy. Instead of hiding the tank, I embraced it. I posted online in local forums about the tank's restoration process. I invited veterans and history enthusiasts to come by on weekends to learn about its design. I even partnered with a local high school shop teacher to offer technical walkthroughs for interested students. The narrative was no longer Karen's to control. It was mine. The next morning, Karen pulled up in her Lambo again, though this time she didn't park across my gate. She parked just to the side of it. A passive-aggressive gesture that whispered I could if I wanted to. As she stepped out, she looked at the tank, then back at me as I stood sipping my coffee from the porch. "This isn't over, Darren." I smiled. "I know. That's what makes it fun." She scoffed and walked off in a cloud of perfume and arrogance. But something told me she had something new planned, something louder. And I was going to be ready for it. Because when someone tries to turn your property into their playground, sometimes the only answer is a vehicle that weighs 52 tons and doesn't care about Lamborghinis. The air carried that eerie weight that only comes before a storm, not of the weather kind, but something far more personal. The morning was unusually still, the kind that made birds quiet and neighbors peek out their windows without stepping onto their porches. I knew something was off the moment I found an envelope taped to my garage door. It wasn't the typical glitter-stained Karen-style delivery. This one was plain, formal, and printed with a gold HOA seal. I opened it with mild dread, half expecting another round of manufactured violations or a laughable warning about grass length. But this was something different. An official summons for a neighborhood conflict resolution hearing, scheduled 2 days from now at the community clubhouse. The letter accused me of hosting intimidating displays of weaponized equipment, endangering communal mental peace, and, this was the most absurd of all, excessive patriotic posturing. I reread that last line at least 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The signature at the bottom didn't just belong to Karen. It was co-signed by an acting HOA attorney, a man named Brock Hensley. That name rang a bell. A quick online search turned up a photo of a guy wearing mirrored sunglasses, holding a martini, and posing beside Karen at what appeared to be a poolside HOA mixer. He wasn't a licensed attorney. He wasn't even a paralegal. He was Karen's third cousin who once took an online legal workshop. Yet here he was, apparently representing the full force of Karen's cardboard courtroom. I wasn't about to play along. But I wasn't going to ignore it either. So I drove down to the county office again and requested an official review of the HOA's recent documentation. This time, I was met not by Janelle at the front desk, but by a stone-faced supervisor named Harris who looked like he hadn't smiled since dial-up internet. I explained everything: property lines, fraudulent maps, the Lambo incidents, even the tank. He remained completely expressionless until I mentioned the conflict resolution hearing. Then he frowned. "Wait. They scheduled a hearing on your property without confirming you're actually part of the HOA?" I nodded. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard, then leaned back. "That's illegal. They can't impose HOA governance on a property that opted out and predated the charter. Your home is exempt by statute. If they move forward, it'll backfire on them." That was the first real win in days. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't let logic or legality stop her. So I prepared for the worst. I spent that night reinforcing the tank's treads and running checks on its systems. It wasn't about intimidation. It was about readiness. People like Karen only back down when the wall they're pushing against refuses to move. The next day, while checking my mailbox, I found something even stranger than a summons. A glossy flyer for an upcoming HOA community showcase with a new feature: driveway yoga returns, now with celebrity guests. The main photo showed Karen striking a yoga pose, on my property, right in front of the tank with the caption, "Inner peace amongst iron giants." It wasn't just another yoga stunt. It was a PR war. That same evening, a delivery truck pulled up near my barn. The driver handed me a clipboard and said, "One portable stage, speakers, and outdoor lighting system for setup." Karen had used the HOA funds to rent equipment for her publicity event, without notifying any of the actual homeowners. It was an invasion disguised as a wellness retreat. I refused the delivery, but the truck simply drove to Karen's house, where she waved like royalty overseeing a festival. 2 more trucks arrived later with canopies, catering supplies, and, bizarrely, inflatable flamingos. It didn't end there. The following morning, the HOA group chat, which I was forcibly added to weeks ago, lit up with pictures of event prep and hashtags like #TankZen and #MetalMeditation. My barn had become the backdrop to her ego campaign. A local influencer even posted, "Can't wait to stretch in front of that cool military thingy." So urban retro. By now, the war wasn't just over property. It was over the story. Karen had shifted tactics. If she couldn't kick me out or out-lawyer me, she would rebrand me. Turn the tank into her set piece. Use my identity like an accessory to her aesthetic. But I wasn't going to be repackaged. I called Janelle again and asked her if there was any county ordinance that restricted the type of events an HOA could host near non-member property. She said there wasn't, but there were nuisance laws that could be enforced if the event disrupted private life or created a public safety issue. That was all I needed. I spent the rest of the day turning my barnyard into a reminder that this wasn't a playground. I set up a legal notice board outside my gate with a printed message: Federal Registry, Historic Military Equipment Zone. No unauthorized filming. No trespassing. Live monitoring active. Then, I installed a full perimeter of passive sensors. Nothing dangerous, just enough to trigger spotlights if someone got too close. That night, the lights flared on twice. The first time it was Karen's nephew trying to pose on the tank for TikTok. The second time it was Karen herself, pacing, phone in hand, whispering to someone in a hushed and panicked tone. I didn't hear much, but I caught one phrase clearly: "Why is he not scared? He's supposed to be scared." The morning of the event arrived like a circus storm. Cars lined up down the street. Folding chairs were arranged in rows on HOA grounds just a few feet from my fence. Karen, in her finest pastel workout set, stood on a mini-stage waving to residents and influencers alike. There was a guy with a drone. Another man with a gimbal. People were taking selfies near my gate as if I were a landmark on some ridiculous tour. Karen took the mic and announced, "Let's all take a deep breath and release the tension caused by unnecessary fear-mongering." The crowd laughed politely. She gestured toward my barn. "It's about coexisting with our history. Even if that history is a little heavy." Right then, I flipped the switch inside my barn. The tank engine roared to life, loud and defiant. The noise cut through her speech like a chainsaw through meditation. Several people stumbled back, startled. Karen froze mid-stretch. I drove the tank slowly out of the barn and stopped it inches from my property line, facing her event. I didn't cross the line. I didn't need to. I parked it like a sentinel, engine purring, steel gleaming. Then I got out, stood beside it, and crossed my arms. The cameras turned away from Karen. They turned toward me. I saw the influencer from earlier whisper something to her agent, then abruptly pack up and leave. The drone guy hovered over the tank for one last shot before flying off. Karen tried to regain control of the narrative. She raised her arms and said, "Remember, today's about peace, not provocation." But the audience had lost interest. The noise, the optics, the presence of a real, grounded, unstoppable force had shattered the illusion. Karen had wanted a spectacle. Now she had one she couldn't direct. By afternoon, most of the guests had filtered out. The event collapsed under the weight of its own ridiculousness. Karen stood alone on the stage, watching me, fuming. I gave her a small wave. She stormed off without saying a word. But I knew her silence wasn't surrender. It was retreat. And every retreat, in her mind, meant preparation for a comeback. What she didn't know was that mine had already begun. The next few days passed in a strange kind of calm, like the eye of a hurricane, and I knew it wasn't real. Karen was far too vindictive to let the failed yoga circus be the end of it. She had tasted public embarrassment, and if I knew anything about people like her, it was that they didn't rest until they found someone else to blame for their own downfall. I was that someone. I spent those days not celebrating, but reinforcing everything. Every camera on my property was tested and backed up to an off-site server. I updated the software on the tank's GPS monitor, double-checked the tread pressure, and went through my garage like a man preparing for war in the most suburban sense. I wasn't worried about physical danger. No, the real threat came in the form of citations, forged documents, and performative drama that manipulated every neighbor within earshot. And Karen was nothing if not a master manipulator. Sure enough, it started with another official-looking letter shoved into my mailbox. It claimed to be a community disruption notification, filed by a subcommittee that didn't actually exist in the HOA bylaws. It stated that I was under review for creating a hostile presence, citing my tank as an urban psychological hazard, and listing anonymous complaints about engine noise, military-grade intimidation, and decreased neighborhood walkability. It would have been laughable if not for the attachment, a blurry photo of the tank taken at night, accompanied by handwritten notes pointing out so-called threats like unlabeled switches and unauthorized reflective surfaces. It was clearly Karen's handwriting, right down to the looping letter Ks and the overuse of underlining. She was trying to build a case. A weird, confusing, completely fictional case. But this time, she wasn't going to hide behind HOA policy. She had taken things to the county safety board. A day later, 2 county officials showed up unannounced, wearing blue jackets and uncertain expressions. One of them was clearly nervous. The other just looked exhausted. They asked to conduct a courtesy evaluation of my barn, citing a recent community complaint. I offered them coffee instead. When I showed them the official federal documentation of the tank, the legal zoning exemptions, and the historic preservation status, they both relaxed. I even invited them to walk around it. One of them turned out to be a veteran himself. He asked if he could take a photo beside it. I said sure. 10 minutes later, they left, satisfied and a little amused. But the real moment came after they were gone. Not 30 minutes had passed before Karen herself walked past my fence with her phone up, pretending to film a vlog but obviously trying to catch me reacting. I didn't give her anything. That night, I received a flood of texts from neighbors I hadn't spoken to in weeks. Apparently, Karen had gone door to door warning residents that I was harboring unstable equipment and might be planning to use it during a future HOA meeting. She even held a backyard wine mixer titled, "Keeping Our Streets Safe," where she dramatically told stories about how tanks represented trauma and said things like, "We can't live in peace with war machines staring at us." What she didn't count on was one of the guests secretly filming the whole thing and sending it to me. In the footage, she even claimed I had no emotional regulation and once threatened to drive the tank over someone's car. That was the final straw. I printed the transcript of her claims, paired it with legal documentation proving my ownership and permits, and sent it to the local paper's opinion editor along with a simple message. When does an HOA cross the line from authority to harassment? I didn't expect much, but within 24 hours, it ran online with the headline, "Suburban Man Targeted for Owning Restored Military Vehicle." The article was surprisingly fair, even painting Karen's yoga event as a bizarre overreach. Public sentiment started to shift. People began commenting. Neighbors came up to me during walks with their dogs and offered quiet support. One even said, "Honestly, I've always wanted to sit in that thing." Karen responded the way anyone in her position would. She escalated again. It was just past noon when the shouting started. I was inside the house, writing emails, when I heard the voice from outside yelling in that familiar tone of manufactured panic. I looked out the window to see Karen standing in front of my gate again, phone in one hand, waving at a tow truck with the other. The tow driver looked completely confused. She kept yelling things like, "This is a danger to the children," And it's a code violation. I demand removal. I rushed outside just in time to see the driver take a photo of the tank, then slowly back away, clearly aware that he was in over his head. Karen turned her attention to me. I'm not letting this thing sit here another day. It's monstrous. And you don't even have the courtesy to respect community aesthetic values. I held up my phone, already recording. Say that again, please. She froze. The tone of her voice shifted instantly. Oh, I was just asking about your project. I think the community would love a tour. She walked away a little too fast, and I noticed something glinting in her hand. It wasn't her phone. It was a set of keys. Later that night, I discovered what she was trying to do. One of the motion cameras on the far side of the barn caught her sneaking near the fence line, trying to find the tank's ignition compartment. The footage was blurry, but clear enough to prove she was trespassing. She had tried to access the tank, probably to tamper with it, maybe even to move it herself, though that was laughably impossible. But it didn't matter what her plan was. I had her on video. I forwarded it straight to the county sheriff's office and filed a formal report. Tampering with military historical equipment, even decommissioned, carries weight. Real weight. The next morning, there was no Karen. No Lambo. No sign of her pacing like a dictator on the verge of another speech. The silence was jarring. I checked the HOA group chat, only to find it full of chaos. A new member had posted, "Why was our president trying to tow a resident's property without authorization?" Another had commented, "I thought she said he was dangerous, now she's breaking into his yard?" There were screenshots of the local article, screenshots of Karen's failed event, even someone making a meme of her holding up crystals in front of a tank with the caption, "HOA versus history." That afternoon, a neighbor named Evelyn rang my doorbell. Elderly, always kind, and the last person I expected to get involved. She looked up at me with a warm smile and said, "You know, my husband was a tank mechanic in Vietnam. He would have loved what you've done with that beast." She reached into her purse and handed me a folded envelope. Inside was a petition, signed by 18 other residents, calling for Karen's removal as HOA president due to abuse of power and public harassment. Evelyn winked and said, "Just thought you'd want to see it before the next meeting." I thanked her, stunned. The war wasn't just mine anymore. Karen had pushed too far, and now the neighborhood was waking up. They weren't rallying behind me because I had a tank. They were rallying because I hadn't used it, not until I had to. And that moment was coming. But I was done reacting. Next time, I'd be the one making the first move. The sun rose on what should have been just another Saturday, but I already knew it wouldn't be. The moment I opened my front door, I could hear the faint hum of distant engines and the low murmur of voices. There were more cars than usual parked along the street, and folding chairs were being arranged in neat rows in front of the community clubhouse. I didn't even need to check the HOA group chat to know what was happening. It was time for the emergency HOA meeting that had been scheduled after the petition circulated demanding Karen's removal. I hadn't planned to attend. My involvement, as far as I was concerned, had already played its part. But the petition had gathered momentum. By the end of the week, it had over 30 signatures, more than enough to force a board vote. That morning, however, something told me I needed to be there. Not as a protester, not as a homeowner, but as a reminder. By the time I arrived at the edge of the gathering, the crowd had nearly doubled. Karen stood at the front, dressed in an immaculate white blouse and flanked by her usual inner circle. She was smiling, but the tightness in her jaw and the subtle twitch in her eye said otherwise. She hadn't expected this many people to show up. Certainly not this many who weren't applauding her. One woman near the front was holding up a handwritten sign that read, "We want peace, not power." Another had a printed screenshot of Karen's attempt to tow the tank, with a bold caption underneath, "Who's really the threat?" Karen cleared her throat and began to speak, launching into a rehearsed speech about community safety, shared values, and the need for visual harmony. She blamed a recent influx of aggressive elements, 4 causing disruption, and claimed her actions were merely an attempt to preserve the aesthetic peace of the neighborhood. Her voice was calm, carefully modulated, but I saw her scan the crowd again and again, looking for cracks, for support, for signs that her influence still held. I stood in the back, unnoticed at first, until one of the residents pointed in my direction and whispered something. Heads turned. Karen faltered just slightly, barely perceptible, but I saw it. Her smile stiffened. She continued anyway, now shifting her focus. She spoke of the threat of escalation and the dangers of encouraging a militaristic presence in a civilian zone. She didn't name me directly, but every word was aimed at me. That's when I stepped forward. Not rushed, not angry, just deliberate. The path cleared almost naturally. People moved aside, silent now, as I walked up to the front, stopped 10 feet from the stage, and simply stood. I didn't speak. I didn't gesture. I didn't need to. Behind me, the quiet rumble of a diesel engine began to echo down the road. Karen squinted past me toward the sound. Her mouth opened in shock as the tank came into view, crawling at a snail's pace down the paved street, gleaming in the morning sun. It wasn't charging. It wasn't honking. It was just moving. My friend Carlos was at the wheel. Licensed, careful, and legally allowed to drive it during parades or historical functions. And that morning it was both. Draped across the front was a large vinyl banner that read, "Historical Artifact. Proudly protected. Fully legal." The crowd erupted, not in fear but in laughter, applause, and the clicking of hundreds of phone cameras. Karen's attempt at painting me as a threat was unraveling right before her eyes. The very thing she had tried to turn into a symbol of danger was now a prop in her own public humiliation. She tried to shout something about safety violations, but the noise drowned her out. She motioned to her clipboard guys, but they just looked confused. No one was following her lead. Then came the final blow. A woman in a sharp navy blazer stepped onto the makeshift stage and asked for the microphone. She introduced herself as a legal representative from the County Oversight Board, invited after multiple residents submitted formal complaint. She read from a prepared statement that outlined not only Karen's misuse of HOA funds but also the illegal zoning map changes, the unauthorized surveillance equipment, and the fraudulent documentation submitted to expand the HOA boundaries. Her tone was neutral, surgical, and absolutely devastating. Karen tried to interrupt, but the woman raised a hand. As of now, you are suspended pending a formal review. All HOA decisions made under the altered map are nullified. Effective immediately, you are no longer authorized to represent the community in any legal or administrative capacity. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around, expecting outrage on her behalf. Instead, the crowd watched quietly, with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. She took one step down from the stage, then another, and by the time her heels hit the grass, it was over. Just like that. She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She simply turned and walked away, her entourage scattering behind her like confused geese. The tank rolled to a stop and parked near the curb, its engine now silent. I stepped up to the front, only after someone handed me the microphone. I didn't plan a speech, so I didn't give one. I just said I never wanted a fight. I only wanted my driveway back. It was enough. Over the next hour, people stayed. They asked questions about the tank. They shared HOA horror stories. Some even came by my property afterward just to thank me. Not because I embarrassed Karen, but because I stood up. Because I reminded them that ridiculous rules crumble under truth if you stand your ground long enough. Later that evening, as the street cleared and the last of the folding chairs were packed away, I found something on my front porch. A basket. Inside was a toy Lamborghini, a plastic tank, a bottle of wine, and a handwritten note that read, "Next time, just run it over." No name. No signature. Just a quiet joke from a neighbor who finally understood what the rest of us had been putting up with. I stood in the driveway for a long while after that, watching the tank reflect the fading sunset. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a symbol, not of war, but of boundaries, of respect, of a line drawn that you don't cross unless you're ready for the consequences. In the weeks that followed, Karen officially resigned. The HOA board underwent a complete restructuring. The new president was Evelyn, the sweet older woman who handed me the petition in the first place. One of her first acts was to ban any future HOA activity within 20 feet of a non-member's property and to reissue the bylaws in plain English so no one could manipulate them again. As for I got a call from Atlas Defense Systems the following Monday. The hiring manager had seen the article and the footage. He didn't even ask me interview questions. He just said, "If you can handle a suburban war zone, you'll do great on our team." Life returned to normal, or something close to it. I started teaching local kids about engineering and mechanics on weekend. The tank stayed parked near the barn, its job complete. I hadn't driven over the Lamborghini. But I didn't have to. Because sometimes, making someone fear what might happen is more powerful than actually doing it. And in Karen's case, her worst nightmare wasn't destruction. It was being irrelevant. And she was. Completely. Irreversibly. Finally.